Good evening. The Trobe University acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of a Kulin nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. My name's Richard Larkins, and I'm the Chancellor of La Trobe University. On behalf of La Trobe, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our 8th and final Bold Thinking Series event for 2018 with the Honourable Julie Bishop MP. We're delighted once more to have the opportunity to work with Ms Bishop for a La Trobe event. While the Victorian state election is about to take place here in Melbourne, the national political landscape has also been a dynamic space in recent months and years, as we're all aware. With this in mind, tonight's event considers the challenge of politics in the new era of social media, the balance between moderate and conservative policy making for the Liberal Party, and what its guiding principles should be. There's perhaps no better person to explain this than Ms Bishop. She'll be talking tonight on politics, leadership and the Liberal Party. After her short keynote speech, Ms Bishop will be joined by a panel comprising two of La Trobe's Emeritus professors, sociologist John Carroll and political expert Judith Brett, as well as incoming academic and journalist Andrea Carson, to discuss the current challenges facing the Liberal Party. The discussion will be facilitated by journalist, writer and broadcaster Francis Leach and will be followed by an audience Q&A. So to introduce our speakers tonight, the Honourable Julie Bishop MP has served as member for Curtin in the House of Representatives since 1998. She was Australia's first female Foreign Minister, serving from the 18th of September 2013 to 28th of August 2018, after 4 years in the role of Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Ms Bishop was the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party from December 2007 to August 2018. Before entering Parliament, Ms Bishop was a commercial litigation lawyer in Perth with Clayton Utz, becoming a partner in 1985 and managing partner in 1994. Ms Bishop graduated with a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Adelaide in 1978 and attended Harvard Business School in Boston in 1996, completing the Advanced Management Program for Senior Managers. In 2017, the University of Adelaide awarded Ms Bishop the honorary degree of Doctor of University for her contribution to the Australian Parliament. Emeritus Professor Judith Brett joined La Trobe in 1989 to teach and research Australian politics, political biography and political history, and retired at the end of 2012. In 2017, she published the book The Enigmatic Mr Deakin, which won the 2018 National Biography Award and has now been shortlisted in the Prime Minister's Literary Awards Prize in the Australian History category. She also writes regularly for the Monthly on Contemporary Australian Politics. John Carroll is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at La Trobe. His degrees in mathematics, economics and sociology from the Universities of Melbourne and Cambridge. His work focuses on culture and its crucial role in the human search for meaning, with particular reference to the modern Western society. He's written a number of books, including his most recent, Land of the Golden Cities, Australia's Exceptional Prosperity and the Culture That Made It, and also is a frequent writer of essays and newspaper articles. Andrea Carson is the most recently appointed Associate Professor in the Department of Communication and Media at La Trobe. Her research examines politics and the media, with special interest in the media's role in democracy and political communication. She has done extensive research on investigative journalism, Australian politics, public opinion, gender in politics, election campaigns and digital media, and holds a PhD in political science and an MA in international politics from the University of Melbourne. So you can see we have a wonderful panel as well as a wonderful keynote speaker. Would you now please join me in welcoming Ms Bishop to the stage.
Thank you, Chancellor, guests. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening for the La Trobe University Bold Thinking series. And this evening I'll speak about a number of issues that are challenging the ideals of liberal democracies around the world and indeed here in Australia, and what appears to be a declining confidence in government. First, some context. Modern democracies evolved to avoid the violent change of governments which were being routinely overthrown by disgruntled citizens or rival factions or external invaders, and often through revolution, disrupting the old system and bringing in a new system. The ballot box, the non-violent expression of the will of the people, promised government change without violent disruption, although the debate about the various models of government came into sharp focus in the first half of the 20th century, which was defined by 2 world wars and a Great Depression. The role of government in the financial and economic collapse between the wars and the rise of totalitarianism, with few limits, if any, on power, led to unspeakable disasters and human tragedy. At the end of World War II, democracy was imposed on West Germany and Japan, as it was judged the best bulwark against a repeat of military aggression. Then from about the 1970s in particular, electoral democracies flourished from about 35 to over 110 nations, country after country on every continent of the planet. In 1989, anticipating the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, Francis Fukuyama famously published an essay, The End of History. Note, there was a question mark, in which he argued the triumph of the West, of the Western idea, is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable, systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. Perhaps the collapse of the Soviet bloc was inevitable, as Friedrich Hayek in his 1943 polemic, The Road to Serfdom, suggested, when he argued that socialist and totalitarian central planning led to economic stagnation, and governments with limited resources should foster competition. Now, even China's embrace of formal socialism was seen as increasingly qualified by its greater desire to emerge as a market economy, particularly as it entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. At the same time, liberal democracies were being incubated and nurtured by established democracies. The international rules-based order continued to evolve. That framework of treaties and alliances and conventions and norms and institutions underpinned by international law that had been built since the Second World War to guide the behaviour of nations and their behaviour towards each other. The international rules-based order was, in fact, instigated, promoted, defended, guaranteed by the United States, seen as a model of democratic values and freedoms in an effort to make a functioning world out of chaos. As the 20th century closed, it was a reasonable bet that the long ideological battle over which socio-political model was best for human affairs was settled. Democracies were seen by experts as inherently stable, focusing on human rights and freedoms, more likely to have stronger, more developed economies, more likely to reach higher income status. Democracies were less likely to go to war against each other. However, today there are real signs of democracy in trouble. The global financial crisis of 2008 marked a turning point with a massive loss of faith in Western financial systems and institutions. The value of globalisation is being questioned. There are concerns about inequality, lack of opportunity, disenfranchisement. These have manifested in the Brexit vote, the election of President Trump and other unorthodox leaders, with the voting public losing faith in the political class and turning to anti-establishment, anti-politicians to give them answers. And the international rules-based order is under strain, indeed under challenge, from the egregious examples of North Korea in utter defiance of numerous unanimous UN Security Council resolutions, to China cherry-picking which parts of the rules-based order it will adhere to and which parts it will ignore, and now the United States pulling out of institutions and treaties that it itself had championed. The Washington-based Pew Research Centre carried out a large survey in 2017 on confidence in democracy, about 38,000 people across 38 nations, including Australia. Now, the good news from my perspective is that of the Australians surveyed, 88% were committed to democracy, but only 40% were strongly committed. 41% preferred an unelected panel of experts to govern the country. 19% preferred a single strong leader who is unrestrained by parliaments or courts, and 12% opted for military rule. Now, overall, 58% were satisfied that democracy was working, with 41% dissatisfied. The global median was about 46% dissatisfied. And a key question in this survey was, how much do you trust your national government to do what is right for your country? Of the Australians surveyed, 7% said they had a high level of trust. 41% had some level of trust. Now, I am a believer in the genius of democracy. No other model offers the world anywhere near the benefits of the liberal democratic model. Churchill had it right. But it's alarming that a significant number of Australians think that military or civilian dictatorship is a viable alternative. I think it's fair to assume that this is steeped in cynicism about the way politics is conducted and or a disconnect between what governments can actually do and what is now expected of them. And that can lead to a permanent state of disappointment. Promises of more government spending invariably disguises the fact that there is a significant portion of the annual Commonwealth budget that is non-discretionary. There's fixed spending on welfare, health, education, defence, and that while we can adjust priorities, it really is only at the margins. Now, this brings me to the Liberal Party. In coalition, the most successful political movement over the past 70 years, having been in government for the majority of that time. The Liberal Party was founded on a belief in the individual, in freedom, in choice, backing the enterprising spirit of our people over government intervention and concentration of power. And as a Liberal, I am committed to the empowerment of the individual, to a competitive economy that enables small business in particular to thrive as the driver of our economy. And today, over half of the private sector jobs are in small business. Reducing taxes to the lowest sustainable level while not compromising our ability to fund essential services that the public need, not imposing unnecessary regulation that stifles innovation and enterprise. That's what I believe. And herein lies a key divide between Liberal and Labor. The level of regulation of employment is a key battleground. Market forces must be allowed to operate fairly so employers can adjust their businesses quickly to changing circumstances to protect and promote greater opportunity. Labor, as the political arm of the trade union movement, is captive to the ideology and activism of union bosses steeped in the past, epitomised by Sally McManus, the head of the ACTU, who seeks a return to conflict between employers and employees, industrial action and strikes. And history's shown the union bosses who hold the concentration of power are the only winners in that circumstance. The need for competitive forces applies to the market and to the workings of government, where there needs to be greater contestability. Populist policies are on the rise around the world, where those in power see an opportunity for political gain through populist stances. Now, this is really complex because a democratic government needs votes. You've got to get elected. And short-term fixes can be superficially attractive, even though history and experience shows that they're invariably detrimental in the long term. Protectionism, higher tariffs, industry subsidisation, unaffordable expansion of the welfare state. And leaders and parties must be challenged at every level. Is this a policy for the long-term benefit of our citizens? Is this a short-term fix? Now, Thomas Sowell, somebody for whom I have high regard, a professor at Stanford's Hoover Institution, has said much about the dangers of populism when he observed, when you want to help people, tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, tell them what they want to hear. Now, he devised a 3-point test through which we should view every policy that is perhaps deemed to be short-term and populist. First, compared to what? In other words, is this the best available policy to resolve this issue, fix this problem, address this matter? And that's where contestability, the battle of ideas, is so important. Is this really the best policy available? Compared to what? At what cost? Not just money, human cost. Populists don't often worry about the cost. Third, what's the evidence? We have to adhere to evidence-based policy making. What is the evidence? What's the experience? What do we know? Can we trial this, scale it up, roll it out? Or should we look at the evidence and see that this just isn't going to work? Now, I've added a fourth. Compared to what? At what cost? What's the evidence? I've added a fourth. What could possibly go wrong? Now, having been a cabinet minister since 2006, or a shadow cabinet minister, and having served in the Howard, Abbott and Turnbull cabinets, I can assure you that contestability is vital. It's absolutely crucial to test policies, to test ideas, particularly in the heat of an election campaign. Now, much has been said recently about the so-called internal conflict between the moderate wing and the conservative wing of the Liberal Party. Our founder, Robert Menzies, said, "We took the name Liberal because we were determined to be a progressive party, willing to make experiments, in no sense reactionary, but believing in the individual, his rights and his enterprise." Had he been alive today, he would have said, his, her, and rejecting the socialist panacea. Now, given that I'm generally classified as a moderate, allow me to articulate how I am guided by the philosophical underpinnings of our party. What is described as classic conservatism is a key foundation of the Liberal Party. Edmund Burke is most often credited with the first clear articulation of conservatism in his Reflections on Revolution in France. Conservatism is not an ideology like socialism, communism, fascism. One of the key tenets of conservatism is a scepticism and rejection of ideological approaches, thus Menzies' rejection of the socialist panacea. Conservatism means respect for institutions and traditions built up over time, in contrast to revolutionary acts. This doesn't mean institutions are exempt from change, but reform should be pursued incrementally and constructively. Established institutions, traditions and values provide important anchor points of stability and shouldn't be subjected to major change without justification. We must be sceptical of those who advocate radical change, and even more of those who advocate revolutionary change. Conservative support for the traditional family unit remains a key focus of all coalition governments, and the debate about same-sex marriage created challenges for the coalition. I believe more so for Labor, who proved incapable of doing anything about this issue for the 6 years that they were in power. But a key question was whether changes to allow same-sex marriage weakened the traditional institution of the family unit and marriage between a man and a woman or not. Now, conservatism is not a prescriptive ideology and doesn't provide prescriptive responses to changing circumstances and attitudes. And in line with our philosophy, individual members of the coalition voted on same-sex marriage according to their personal views and judgment. And voting didn't conform to the so-called moderate conservative divide. In any event, the Liberal Party acknowledges the right of members to cross the floor even on agreed party positions, even ministers, although the convention is that they step down from the ministry. Now, that's another reason why I'm a Liberal. I wouldn't want to be part of an organisation that took away my personal discretion to exercise my judgment on matters of great importance. Respect for the judgment and decisions of the individual fundamentally sets the Liberal Party apart from Labor, which still draws inspiration from failed socialist ideologies. Now, let me turn to the question of climate change. Within our party, there's justifiable concern about the distorting impact on our economy of many of the proposed responses. Our economic strength has been underpinned by affordable and reliable energy, mostly from fossil fuels. That's a fact. Our cities and industries cannot function without reliable sources of energy, priced at levels to ensure that we're internationally competitive. But this must and has to be balanced with concerns for our environment and the preservation of our planet. There are no easy solutions. We had a very long and complex debate within the Cabinet and within our party room about a national energy guarantee. And this was backed by business, and now, given Labor's policy, this may well have been the only framework that could have achieved that elusive bipartisan response. We should, as a priority, ensure there's a stable investment climate for new energy generation. And as a former Minister for Science, it's a source of great frustration for me that we can't even have a bipartisan discussion on nuclear power. It's a no-go zone. And if the risks of climate change are on the scale Labor believes, it is irresponsible of them to rule out an option that could generate low-emission baseload power. And the advent of electric cars alone, having to be plugged in every night, will make baseload power increasingly critical. So at this junction, with democracy in distress, the rules-based order under challenge, a loss of faith in the political class in an increasingly contested and complex world, we as politicians, policymakers, regulators, should redouble our efforts to explain the underlying principles behind our policies and our approach to government. We must articulate our support for democracy and engage more with our citizens to bring them with us. This requires persuasive advocacy, rational argument, and leadership on the benefits of the best, most successful long-term model for social and economic development in terms of the wealth and the freedom and the choice that democracy offers its citizens. A retreat from democracy would mean, invariably, more instability, more conflict, less regard for freedom, less regard for human rights, less prosperity. We must uphold and defend what has benefited our economy, including free, open, liberalised trade and selling our high-quality goods around the world, and foreign investment. I mean, this is a key to our success in being the only country in the world to have achieved 27 consecutive years of uninterrupted economic growth as the 13th largest economy in the world. We must re-emphasise the need for structural reform, for lifting productivity, for paying down debt, and embracing technological advances to ensure our workforce is augmented by technology, by automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, that disrupts all that we do. But we need a strategy of augmentation, reskilling, retraining, relearning, embracing technological change. Now, all this means that our elected representatives must build and rebuild trust and faith. And a more representative parliament is key. No nation will reach its full potential unless it fully engages with and harnesses the skills, talents, ideas and energy of the 50% of its population that is female. In our case, 51%. That, I believe, is now critical to building trust and confidence in our ability to deliver a free, open and fair society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Bishop. My name is Francis Leach. I'm about to facilitate this conversation with Ms Bishop and our panellists, Judith, John and Andrea. Could you please give them a round of applause as they make their way to the stage? We will be also having time at the end of our discussion for a conversation with you as well. There will be microphones made available to you. So as you are listening, make sure you note a few questions, introduce yourself, keep them succinct, and we'll have that conversation in a little while. I wanted to start with you, Julie, and ask you, what you've outlined there is radical change in the international order in a very short space of time. Have you been shocked, given your long history in government, have you been shocked at how quickly all of this has happened?
In one sense, the signs were there, but in another sense, it has been a radical shift. We have seen resistance to a commitment to the international rules-based order from some unexpected quarters. China and Russia are being far more assertive. The United States, under President Trump, is withdrawing from institutions that it once championed. I must say, it didn't start with President Trump. This has been a trajectory of previous US administrations. Perhaps he's just more flamboyant in the way he goes about announcing the parts of the rules-based order that will or will not apply to the United States. I've been speaking for some time, or had been speaking for some time as Foreign Minister, about my concern that the rules-based order was under threat, under challenge. And probably it came home to me most starkly with the actions of Russia in its illegal annexation of Crimea. That was the first time since the Second World War that military force had been used to redraw boundaries. And Australia responded by supporting the international effort to impose sanctions on Russia. But it also brought home to me how difficult it was to achieve a global response to a global issue when the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council can effectively exempt themselves through veto from compliance. And I think that that has highlighted that the system must evolve, the system must change to take into account changing circumstances. Likewise, the rise of protectionism and the push against free and open trade in the face of all of the evidence to the contrary has been quite disturbing. And the fact that the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a red flag for us. We went ahead and concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership essentially with the support of Japan and other nations. There are now 11 nations in the TPP. But it's worth remembering that both sides of the US presidential campaign in 2016 were against the United States being a party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
We haven't had the same level of economic disruption that the United States has had, and that lack of faith in those institutions and the lack of faith in the international order, which had delivered generations of prosperity in the post-war period, John. So what are we seeing in Australia where people are also losing faith in the political parties that have governed us successfully for over 100 years? What's the cultural and social underpinnings of that?
Well, I think good evening, everybody. I think there are a number of things to say here. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far tonight, and I think needs to come onto the table, is the strength of political leadership. Whenever political leadership is weak, and it doesn't matter which side of politics it is, and I think we've had 4 weak prime ministers in a row, and this is the major factor in this discussion. It's not.
Can I ask you, when you say weak, what are the elements that you would describe fundamental to an idea of a strong leader?
Well, they've been weak in different ways. Shakespeare's history plays basically essentially preoccupied with what happens when you have a weak king. What are the consequences of a weak king? And the consequences are pretty simple. It means that one level down from the king, which is the feudal lords in those particular cases, they become dissatisfied, they start to fight each other, they start to fight the king, all sorts of disruption and instability follows, and we've seen this in Labor, and we've seen this recently in the coalition. Malcolm Turnbull's the most recent example. Let me give 2 examples of the ways in which he seemed a weak leader to me. One policy, he talked a lot about innovation, it was almost central to his ideology of what the Liberal Party and the country should be doing. But there was very little practical policy. It was like he had an idea, but he didn't have much practical sense of what innovation actually means. What do you do? What do you do with the CSIRO? What do you do with universities? Where are you going to create new ideas? And then how are you going to implement them? It was too abstract. The other area, and this is major contrast with John Howard, I could list a few of these, is in loyalty. A strong leader manages through one means or another to have the loyalty of the people he or she works with. Now, the most striking thing to me in the farcical coup 2 months ago, whenever it was the number of senior ministers who abandoned Malcolm Turnbull. He attracted such little loyalty. This reeked of someone who didn't lead his own party very well. And if you don't lead your own party very well, the government is going to be a shambles. I mean, John Howard learnt this lesson when he first lost the leadership a long time ago. He was famous in his long period as Prime Minister, bringing backbenchers up all the time, keeping good relations with his backbenchers. Now, that's not the only aspect of authority. I mean, there's how you run your cabinet, and taking most decisions to the cabinet, having the support of your colleagues at the different levels of government. But there'd be a couple of aspects of weak leadership in my mind.
But Andrea, this is not a problem that's just alone in the Liberal Party. We saw this on the Labor side of politics as well. So what is it about the body politic in this day and age where that instability has become the new normal?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One that hasn't been mentioned yet is the way that the relationship between politics and media has changed. And we see that particularly with the digital disruption, the commercialisation of the internet from 1995 onwards, which has allowed the migration of analogue advertising to go online. And there you've seen the decoupling of journalism from media outlets. So in terms of cultural institutional power, the traditional media companies have lost some of that. What does that mean for politics? Well, it means that we've got this 24-hour news cycle, it's full of churn, and I like to think of a comment that was made by Tony Blair in 2007. And he said when he first went into politics, he would spend 2 days focusing on a policy proposal. He said by the time he left politics, he was lucky to have 5 minutes, and that most of his job was fronting the media, and that you could lurch from something that started off as quite small to a crisis by the end of the day if that media cycle wasn't well managed. And so Julie Bishop spoke about falling trust. Well, that is true, and that is happening not just in politics, but also Australians' level of trust for media organisations. And The backdrop to part of this digital disruption also is the rise of fake news. And how do we know what's true and what isn't true? And some of the Pew Research studies that were mentioned and other studies that have been done in Australia with aldermen show that Australians really fear about being able to determine what is real and what isn't real. And so we're starting to see some of these traditional institutions, whether they be media or whether it be the traditional political parties, there's new forces that are starting to ebb away at our trust and pulling those apart.
Judith, one person who had the trust of the Australian people was Sir Robert Menzies, and that was how he underpinned his long tenure as Australian Prime Minister. Would he recognise the contemporary Liberal Party as the party that he started?
That's a big question. I mean, because what I was going to say, I was thinking about that, is that the society which Menzies governed was a much simpler society than the one we're living in now. And I think that's a big difference. I mean, so just in terms of the bigger question about, what is it that's eroding trust, I think one of the things that's happened, I mean, when Menzies was governing and Julie Bishop talked about this, there was much more of a sense of the Liberal Party standing for certain values and attitudes that were grounded in middle class experience, and the Labor Party standing for a set of attitudes and policies grounded in working class experience and linked to the trade union movement. That's not what the world now looks like in Australia. Class is no longer as dominant in the way that people form their political identities. There's a lot of much greater ethnic and racial and religious diversity. There's identity and gender issues. So, and the electorate is much better informed in many ways. It's better educated, and so there's a lot more people whose sense of party allegiance is weaker, so that it's harder for the political parties. They can no longer. John Howard's talked about this, where there was once, 40% of your support base was rusted on both sides, and you were competing over 20%. You're now more likely competing over 40%, and it's probably getting bigger with the minor parties. So I think Menzies would find it hard to recognise the complexity of the society. But one thing I would like to say that I think would really disappoint him about aspects of the contemporary Liberal Party is its anti-intellectualism. The attitude to science, or the scepticism towards science, that's been shown by some members in terms of the climate change debate, and also the ambivalence about universities, I think, which we see not in all of the Liberal Party, but in some members. I think that would disappoint him greatly.
Just following on from that, Julie, there's a sense of, you said when you were speaking that true liberalism wasn't an ideology, in fact was a practice of critical thinking. Mm. But within your contemporary party there is an ideology, and I guess it broadly identifies itself as being the conservative wing. So how has that become the case that you have now people who are anti-intellectual and reject the foundation of peer-reviewed science, which has underpinned everything that we've ever achieved in contemporary society in terms of advancement in technology, and are prepared to turn their back on the things that probably were the key to the success of the Liberal Party over the last 70 years?
I think it's a combination of a number of issues that have been raised this evening. The role of social media has had a huge impact, even in the 20 years that I've been in politics. It's changed dramatically. I mean, Robert Menzies would have had to sit at his desk and look up and see half his backbench giving their views on Sky News every other minute. He wouldn't have had to corral the team to keep them off social media and the media more generally, where everyone's opinion is able to be aired 24/7. And so the team collection, or the collectivity of the team, if I can put it that way, that was the way you ran a political party in the 1950s and 1960s, indeed the 70s, is just no longer there. I mean, the way constituents communicate with you is so different. When I was first elected a member in 1998, 90% of the contact from constituents was via a letter, by mail. If I got a letter today, I'd call the federal police. So it's a completely different engagement.
You've been warned.
But it's a completely different engagement. And then when I was speaking about populism And the quick fix, because we have an election every 3 years, we're always campaigning. The 24/7 campaign, we're always campaigning. We're always being polled. We're always being judged as to whether we're ahead or behind our opposition. It's just this constant requirement to be winning votes. And I think that science and intellectual thought might well have been the casualty as a result.
I don't think there's anything new about political lack of interest in universities. I mean, a senior member of the Hawke government told me he could not get anyone in the cabinet interested in the universities whatsoever, including the Prime Minister. I don't think this is new. Menzies said similar things about
Menzies himself was a great advocate.
He himself
there was an
yes,
exception.
we're back with leadership, though, aren't we?
There was an exception in the years 2006 to 2007. I was the education minister.
There is something that I would contest, and that is the idea that we are now better informed. We certainly have more information, but whether the electorate writ large is actually better informed, I think, is up for debate. And I say that because studies that have looked at how media presents politics have found that increasingly it's become about the horse race, what's called process news rather than policy news. And this is going on not just in Australia, but right across democracies in the West. That we're getting the poll-driven, who's up, who's down, who's winning, with lots of sporting motifs about the fight.
31 news polls in a row and whatnot.
Exactly,
yeah,
and politicians also buy into this type of logic, which we saw with Malcolm Turnbull. And so even though there's lots of information there, the media landscape's very fragmented, and a lot of this news is very personality-based.
And can I also point out that public opinion can be distorted. If you rely on social media to reflect public opinion, you'll be sorely misled. It's so easy to get up a campaign on a campaign on Facebook, and it purports to represent a significant view or a significant proportion of the Australian public. And politicians who fall for that invariably make bad public policy decisions because it doesn't.
As the person who made this claim, the evidence that I would put is the change in voting behaviour. It used to be the case that the swinging voter, the people who changed their votes between elections because they couldn't remember, were seen as the sort of airheads of the electorate, whereas now swinging voter behaviour has become much more complicated and much more instrumental, which suggests that not all of the electorate, but an increasing proportion of the electorate are actually making strategic decisions. They vote differently between state and federal elections. They vote differently between the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so that suggests a high level of information. And the other thing I would say that I think has been a great stabiliser in Australia has been the fact that we've got compulsory voting. And that means that we've been protected from the sort of highly emotional campaigns that have sometimes we've been seeing, particularly in the United States, which are used to motivate the vote.
Yeah, and also the voter suppression and gerrymandering of electorates, which have become hugely important.
That's our Australian Electoral Commission. Yeah. That's because we've had non-partisan electoral administration since actually the 19th century.
Can we zero in a little bit on the Liberal Party, though, and talk about the notion of the Conservative wing and whether the idea of conservatism that you painted in your talk, Julie, is represented by the people who now call themselves conservatives within the party. Those that led the coup against Malcolm Turnbull consider themselves the conservative wing, but are they conservatives in the true sense, or are they reactionaries, John?
Well, the word conservatives bandied around a lot without much idea of what it might mean, if anything. I was very pleased to hear Julie talk about scepticism as one of the characteristics of conservatism, and an attachment to public order and constitutional order, which I think is number one. I mean, I wrote a piece 2 months ago in The Australian on 5 rules of conservatism, and they were certainly 2 of my rules. And the attachment to order and constitutional order was number one. If you take that to be the case, the coup 2 months ago was not conservative at all. It was insurrectionary. I mean, fundamental to democracy in Australia is that the people elect the government every 3 years. And it's become convention that they elect the Prime Minister. Now, technically, according to the Constitution, they don't. The party elects the leader. But I think it's become a custom, and the public feel this: we elect the Prime Minister. And we actually don't like it when a party then goes and throws out our elected Prime Minister. Now, this group 2 months ago was flouting, I think, the central principle of conservatism and thinking, well, we can just throw out Malcolm Turnbull because for whatever reason. And I think most of their reasons, if you look at it carefully, were not due to ideology, they were due to personal ambition. They were being promised deputy leadership. There were the usual basic human motives of vanity, ambition, fear, in the end panic, driving people, much more than any particular differences of ideology. And one further point, a distinction needs to be made between moral conservatism and political conservatism. Now, Liberals like Tony Abbott seem to me essentially moral conservatives, traditional Catholic, attached to the traditional view of marriage, in favour of characteristics of moral conservatism, in favour of religion, don't like pornography, don't like euthanasia, like good manners and so forth. Now, people of that persuasion, people of that persuasion today probably are more likely to vote Liberal, but historically there have been more traditional Catholics in the Labor Party than the Liberal Party. There's no necessary confluence between moral conservatism and Burkean political conservatism. And so the sort of moral conservatives who, like Tony Abbott, have been very destabilising in recent times, I think have not been political conservative. They haven't shown respect for the Constitution. And the fact that in his case he was removed by a perfectly legal, orderly process. And he should have accepted that, unhappy as he might have been, and gone to the backbench.
John actually does hit the nail on the head, and this is where the debate about conservatism, the moderate wing and the conservative wing, is blurred, because we're not recognising the social conservatism or the moral conservatism, as you call it, as opposed to the classic definition of conservatism. We are all conservatives on the Liberal side of politics in the classic sense of the word. We are all conservatives. But whether you're a religious, moral, social conservative is another issue, and that's when John Howard started talking about the broad church. But I think that the current debate about this is somewhat ill-informed.
I think it's worth, could I just add, I think the Australian people are politically conservative. I mean, they'll do anything not to change the Constitution. It's almost impossible to get referenda changing the Constitution, even on the most trivial things, through. They like the political order. They may not like who's in power, but they like the political order. There's a sort of fundamental political conservatism, but they're not conservative and they're not religiously conservative. I mean, 5% of Australians go to church regularly. It's very small.
But what did it say to the wider public, Andrea, when at the end of that crazy week when Malcolm Turnbull was deposed, that the Parliament stopped for a day because the governing party couldn't get its act together, was focusing on its internal politics and wasn't doing the business of the people? What did that say about the failure of democracy on that day as the Liberal Party tore itself apart? Why should people have faith that they're capable of doing their job?
I think everyone here knows what that says. And I fast forward 2 months later when Scott Morrison was very critical of the ABC for talking about itself, when in fact, when the Liberal Party was talking about itself, it did stop actually working and not getting on with the job. So I think this just feeds into the despair in those falling longitudinal polls that show that trust in politicians and trust in media are on a downward slide.
Can we just keep it in perspective? It was 3 hours. We rose at 2 o'clock instead of 5 o'clock.
3 very important hours, I'd imagine that.
Just 3 hours of question time, come on.
On the issue of rebuilding trust, which is essential to the things that you talked about, Julie, which is a functioning democracy and the international order which has underpinned us. I want to go around the table, so to speak, and ask you what are the key things that need to be done. What's the first step, Julie Bishop, to try and do that?
Well, first, we need strong leadership, as I said, strong leadership, persuasive advocacy, rational arguments in support of what we believe. And explaining in straightforward language what it is that we're seeking to do and seeking to achieve and why. The Australian public are very smart. They get it. They might not get it for all the reasons that we want to articulate it, but there's hardly been an election where they've got it wrong. And even elections where the result is frustrating, they're sending a message. So I think that we have to appeal to their judgment, their understanding, their wisdom, and spend as much time as we can explaining to them why we're doing what we're doing, why we believe what we believe, why this policy is good for the country. And that would go a long way, I think, to having the kind of engagement with the public that I think they desperately want.
Judith, I mean, the participation of Australians in the traditional political party system is shrinking all the time. And if people aren't participating hands-on, then they're not being represented by the parties that want to get their own hands on the lever of government. How do we change that? Or do we need to?
Well, I mean, I think what we need is a period of government that works. You know, like we've had periods at the end of the 60s when we had, you know, Gorton and McMahon, things were not looking great. So I think if we had a period of, you know, 2 terms of a government that worked, where the cabinet worked, where we got evidence-based policy, it would restore a lot of trust.
I mean, I don't think we should overreact. Things aren't bad in this country.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. You know.
You go anywhere else in the world, as I have in recent years, and the Australian political system is highly regarded. Whatever machinations there are in a week in August, at the end of the day, we have one of the longest standing democracies, one of the most stable democracies. We're an open, liberal democracy. We're committed to freedoms, the rule of law, democratic institutions. We're an open, export-oriented market economy. We're highly successful. Our voice is well respected on the world stage. We're not perfect, but I wouldn't get too concerned that Australia is by any means in the dire straits that a number of other countries are.
I was going to say, and I think the media in particular likes to look too much at America as a sort of model, as if somehow we're going to be going down the same path. And I think we've got fundamentally, John's mentioned the fact that it's a much more secular, much less religious society. I've mentioned the compulsory voting. We've also not had the collapse of the economy. There's big differences.
We don't have the polarisation.
We haven't got the polarisation. We haven't.
It's quite evident in the United States at present.
Yeah.
Apart from Sky News after dark.
Yeah, but nobody watches that.
But we do have the issue around participation in the political process, and can you see that changing, Andrea? Because my sense is the more that people are actually involved in the politics that they have a conviction for, the better outcomes we'll have, the better candidates we'll have, and no doubt the better policy positions, but people are either reluctant or feel disengaged or disenfranchised from being involved.
So I'm going to take an optimistic view here and a positive one. I think there's some signs of really positive green shoots. And going back to 2 points that Julie Bishop made about the public sphere, where the discourse takes place, where we engage in ideas, we can test ideas, and the other idea that it's evidence-based. And because I tend to look at politics through the lens of the media, I can see where there's some green shoots where this is happening. And if you do look to the United States, there's been the Trump bump in terms of the quality mastheads. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, all their circulations have gone up. When it comes to evidence-based investigative journalism, and you look at some of the really established names and also some of the new entrants that are producing quality investigative journalism that are able to canvass some of those big global narratives about economic inequality, which we saw with the Panama Papers, being able to prosecute that case against tax evasion, what you're seeing in the United States is funding going towards these not-for-profit media outlets. To me, that speaks volumes. It says that people want quality news, they're prepared to pay for it, and that they're differentiating between the, shall I say, the crap mastheads and those that do produce the good quality. And on top of that, we've got slowly, but Facebook and Google starting to address this fake news issue. They're investing money into fact checking, they're promoting those institutions that do produce quality news by putting their brand name nice and large and asking questions of people when they read it about whether it's fake news, and also weeding out some behaviours. So if someone's a serial poster and putting up 2,000 posts a day, that sort of behaviour gets removed from the platforms.
But John, we have been speaking in silos for a long time now. The conversation across the party aisle isn't what it used to be because of the nature of the technologies in which we communicate. So the algorithms that drive things like Facebook have people of like minds talking to one another, reinforcing their values. Do you have optimism that that conversation, that contest of ideas can be authentically rejoined and better outcomes can be achieved?
Well, I think where you started here, trust is the key thing, and I think Judy's right. Two terms of good government would turn this around completely. I mean, there's a recent big survey out of Monash on social cohesion in Australia, and it finds that I think it's well over 90% of Australians identify with the country and like it as it is. Now, but they also like well-organised things, and they're used to the grand final in Melbourne, the grand final, the tennis open, Sydney Olympics, being extremely well-run big events. Now, it's very frustrating then when you have political and when you have governments that actually don't seem to be running things very well at all, and that would be redressed exactly by, I think, both of your comments of a couple of sessions.
A little bit fair though, if you look at the Gillard government, it was a minority government. There was the same churn that was going on with Gillard and Rudd, and yet the minority government was able to get more than 500 bills through the parliament in that time. So it didn't grind to a standstill.
That's not a marker of good governance.
But it is.
How much legislation you got through the parliament.
It may not be all the measures, but it does show that things are still going on despite the upheaval at the more public level.
It's the appearance of chaos, I think, and that John's talking about, and I think that's been. Some people may have seen the train wreck of an interview, as it's been called, with the Liberal candidate, I should say, for Frankston with David Spears, where he's asked about the Liberal energy policy, and it's like a John Clark, Brian Dawes interview. I mean, it's hilarious. But you have to ask, one of the functions of political parties is to vet the people who become political candidates.
But, this is my
and
point.
So, what exactly was going on in the branches of the Liberal parties in Frankston that this guy got through?
Well, it depends how many people have put their hand up to become a member of Parliament.
Yeah, but
it might well be that we are seeing less people interested in putting their names forward to be a member of Parliament and subjected to the kind of scrutiny and public attention that politicians seem to be receiving now. I wanted to say something about, you talk about the instability and you want a couple of terms of stable government. Well, I think the most recent churn of leaders clearly started with Kevin Rudd. You had 11 years of John Howard, Peter Costello, Alexander Downer in the most significant roles. 11 years, I mean, that's pretty extraordinary in global terms, the same trio. And then Kevin Rudd won with stratospheric popularity, and obviously against the wishes of his own party, because within a couple of years they decided to get rid of him. And the bar for getting rid of a Prime Minister was set very low. They just didn't like him. And it wasn't so much about his policies, because they were all arguing those policies. They just didn't like working with Kevin. That's no reason to get rid of a leader. But that then set the benchmark, and so then the Rudd-Gillard tussle. And then we saw it in our party. And Labor have fixed the problem. Well, it's rather ironic, isn't it, that Kevin Rudd should bequeath to Bill Shorten a mechanism for keeping Bill Shorten in office. I'm sure that's not what Kevin intended. But nevertheless, they have changed it so that they've had the same leader for 5 years. Now, I don't know what that does for the well-being of the internal workings of the Labor Party. I mean, I couldn't possibly comment, but they've got the same leader. And I just don't see the Liberal Party members, that is, the party room members, ever giving up the right to elect and unelect the leader of the party. So whilst you might see it on the Labor side, I don't know whether it's making for happy campers in the Labor Party, but on our side, as long as you retain the confidence.
To see that? Would you like to see that change?
I don't see it. I don't envisage it happening in the Liberal Party.
Would you like to see it, though?
I don't see it as being even possible, whether I liked it or not. You can't envisage a circumstance where Liberals would give up their right that they so jealously guard to elect the leader and elect the deputy leader of the party.
Would you like to see more women in the Liberal Party front bench?
Absolutely.
So what happened, can I just ask, what happened in August when we had the fallout from a number of your colleagues who made it quite clear that they felt that they were bullied out of the party? What's happened to the culture of the Liberal Party where senior women and talented women felt like that their only option was to leave?
Well, that's a distressing situation in any workplace, and I'm doing something about it. I'm supporting an initiative in Western Australia called Empowering Women, where the former state president of the Liberal Party, Danielle Blaine, and I, as patron, contacting young professional women, business women, women working in community organisations, and asking them to come along to Liberal Party functions, not to join the Liberal Party, but just to come along and listen to the debate, listen to the discussions. And tonight in Perth, they're launching Empowering Women, and they have 65 young women who've never been involved in politics, had nothing to do with the Liberal Party, attending an event to hear more about politics. And I think that's a great sign. Now, you can talk all you like about quotas and targets. You need a pool of talented women who are prepared to be considered for politics. Otherwise, you are just going out and choosing a woman and saying, you know, please come in, we need to make up a quota.
You had a number of those and they've decided that they're going to walk away.
Well, people leave politics for all sorts of reasons. We've also got male members who are leaving politics. I don't think that you can, everybody has a different reason for leaving, for saying they've had enough, wanting to move on. It's a pretty brutal environment in terms of workplaces across Australia. I can't think of one that compares.
Andrea, I mean, you feel strongly about this particular issue.
Well, I've come at it from two different perspectives. One is I was doing a program last year at Melbourne University called Pathways to Politics, which was similar to what Julie Bishop's describing. It was a non-partisan program, and it was mentoring women with the skills they need in order to get into politics. The reason this is so important is the pipeline issue that you've just identified. And it's having success. It's in its third year now. 75 women have been through the program, and there's 8 of them contesting this state election. 20% of the women who've been through that program have either been pre-selected or elected at this stage at local and state level. We haven't got anyone in federal yet, and there's been 5 parties that have been represented so far. So that's one aspect of it. The other way that I approach this is I did a study surveying 2,500 Australians, and we did these vignettes that were hypothetical, one about a male politician, one about a female politician. Everything else was identical, except we divided the groups up into randomly, someone got the female, someone got the male. And what we found was that when it came to gender, those that self-identified as being Labor voters or Greens voters saw gender as the number one obstruction for women being successful in politics. When it came to the other side of politics, the Conservative side of politics, gender was not seen as an issue at all. And I think this reflects what's going on with the two parties. You've got the Labor Party that has voluntary quotas. They're set at 50% by 2025. They've almost achieved that in the lower chamber of the parliament. They've got 48% representation that came in the 1990s. And then Liberal doesn't have any quotas at this point. They have other targets and plans to try and increase participation. It's been languishing. The Liberal Party's peak number of women was under John Howard in 1998. It is now 20% female. So there's the fact that the voters don't see it as a problem, that vote for the Conservative side of politics, also shows that the party doesn't see it as a problem until this dialogue happens more, where the fallacy of meritocracy is seen for being the flawed word that it is. Then you're not going to see that 1 in 5 in the Liberal Party lift. And that puts Australia 50th in the world in terms of female representation. The countries that are up the top are all those with quotas, and quotas exist in 118 countries in various forms. So it's not as radical as what it would seem in some of the debates we have here.
Okay, we could continue this conversation for a lot longer, but it's our wish to invite you to be part of it as well. Now, I think we have some microphones. We have one on either side of the room. Please put your hand in the air, introduce yourself, keep your question tight and bright, and direct it to the panellists you'd like to answer to it. So we'll go with Sally's up the back to start with.
Thank you everyone for your thoughts tonight. My name is Blake Riley, I'm a student from the University of Melbourne. My question tonight is directed towards Ms Bishop. You talked before about speaking in a straightforward manner to the public. When your ex-colleague Malcolm Turnbull appeared on Q&A the other night, I think people were pleasantly surprised with the sort of clear, straightforward way that he addressed quite complex issues such as migration and energy policy. Do you think, but of course he was out of Parliament at the time that he appeared on the programme, do you think that too many people that are in Parliament are too concerned with their own parliamentary careers and party ascension that they fail to speak clearly with the public and honestly with the public and therefore engage properly with the public?
Well, I've known Malcolm Turnbull for almost 30 years, and he is a very eloquent and articulate speaker. He was a very fine barrister, and I've heard him advocate cases and submissions over many, many years. So his clarity on Q&A didn't surprise me, I expected it. The issue of trying to please different elements in a party is not easy, and particularly as we have seen leaders removed for their failure to adhere to perspectives or views of elements of a party. We saw it with Kevin Rudd, we saw it with Julia Gillard, we saw it with Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull. And so I think that now leaders are very conscious of the need to keep everyone happy. And that's an impossible task. So the leadership that I think John's alluding to is the kind of leadership where you absolutely believe in your principles and values and positions, and you can persuade others to follow. And that's one of the signs of a good leader.
Some people, can I just follow? Peter Beattie had a sort of direct, pleasant relationship to the electorate where he spoke reasonably frankly. And I think everyone says, yes, this is not just ideology, this is not just the party line. And effectively, as Menzies had this too, partly through his wit. The needs, and I think Scott Morrison's trying to do this, and we'll have to see whether how that goes.
It's not going well, John.
But there needs to be a sort of a feeling of genuineness and a sort of type of integrity, rather than that there's a smoke screen of words being put up.
I also think it's not a very fair comparison. A Q&A in this instance was a 1 hour format where Malcolm was able to answer questions, show his personality, and that's a format that other leaders have used very effectively as well, as opposed to the 3-second grab on the nightly news, which may or may not be your best 3 seconds in the course of an interview or a speech. So the way news is presented is vastly different from a 1 hour interview where you can really let your personality shine.
I think we have a question down the front here.
Hi, I'm James. My question's directed towards Ms Bishop, but also the panel as a whole. So we've heard a lot tonight about issues particular to Australia and Australian democracy, but we've seen across the Western world a suggestion that politics are realigning on a sort of open and closed basis, and we've seen this bisecting parties on the left and the right in France and Germany and the UK and the US. So to Ms Bishop, do you think that the current split between the wets and the dries, or the moderates and the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, is sustainable in light of this global shift? Do you think it will reach Australia, or do you think will largely continue on as we have?
I still think the majority of Australians like to see us governed from roughly the centre left, the centre right. We don't have the levels of extreme political views that we see in other countries, and there are various reasons for that. My sense is that the Australian public are still comfortable with the conservative political view of centre-left, centre-right, essentially across the middle without the extremes. We aren't seeing the polarisation that you see in the United States. You just had to see that map of the US after the midterms to see that you've got two different countries there. What's, the blue edges on the west coast and the east coast, and then the red in the middle, and they appear to have nothing in common. So we don't have that kind of challenge to the same extent, and I would hope that we don't.
But isn't that a function of prosperity? If you talk about that map, you're talking about two very different countries living in two very different economies, and the shrinking middle class in the United States is the key to the loss of faith in the political institutions
and
of
the
government.
sense of disenfranchisement, without question.
Isn't that the key thing to protect then?
Yes, it is. It's absolutely why we have to continue to drive economic growth so that all boats rise on the tide.
But also we're a small country. I mean, there are big we're a much, much smaller country, so it's much simpler, really. And the United States is very big and very complicated and much more fragmented historically. John, I interrupted you, sorry.
I think confidence depends a lot on an optimism about social mobility. And the United States has gone from a country of very high immigration and very, very fast social mobility to one. A shocking statistic, the median wage in real terms in the United States has not gone up in 40 years. So the United States is stagnant economically. Now Australia is so different from that. We had probably had the fastest wage rises in our history in between 2000 and 2012. It's slowed down the last 3 or 4 years. But we're a high social mobility country in which people can have some realistic optimism about their children can be better off than they are, and that's still the case. And this is a crucial sociological difference between us and the United States.
And our economy, as I said earlier, has been growing, averaging 3.3% for the last 27 years. Unemployment is 5.1% across the country. I mean, it's a vastly different economic scenario.
I'll take a question from the gentleman at the...
Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone on the panel. My name's Graham Seeds. A question to Ms. Bishop. One of the things you talked about, firstly, about growth, could we have done better? Because we certainly have unheralded mineral wealth. There's been a boom from China. Everything went very, very well for Australia. So that's one question. But what I really wanted to ask is about, and something you've been attributed to have said, was around that contestability element of Parliament. And there's a view that perhaps when people look into Parliament and the behaviour that people have, contestability is a great thing in democracies, and we do that well, but the basic behaviour of people, we're trying to have a society that talks and communicates and is open, and we can sit in a room like this and we can do that. But in Parliament, the behaviour of people is appalling. Most oftentimes, it's not representative of society as we, interact. And you've said yourself that if we had, if we used the example of most corporations, you wouldn't be able to behave like that. Yet in Parliament, people that represent the people, that's how people behave. So how do we think we change that? And I think getting more women in Parliament would be one way to do that, more representative. But I think the behaviours themselves have to change. And how does that happen?
Well, first we have to recognise that Parliament is, by its very nature, an adversarial system. Under the Westminster system, you have an executive government and you have an opposition whose role in life is to oppose and to get itself into government. So it's a very adversarial, competitive system. It's competitive within your party. They talk about the opposition over there and the enemy behind. It's very, very competitive in every element. Question time is probably the least productive use of our time if you are just observing it as theatre, and no, that kind of behaviour wouldn't be accepted in any workplace in Australia. You can't publicly sledge, defame, slander people as you can under the privilege of Parliament. But it's also where the battle of ideas is fought in a very robust fashion. Of course, we could all behave better, and I'm no angel. I've been part of the effort to get a hit on the other side, because that's how you're judged as a minister. If you can, take down your opposite number, well, then you're a great warrior for the cause. And yet, I know that school teachers are very reluctant at times to allow their school students to witness Parliament because of the standard of behaviour. Now, I think we all have to take stock of that and take personal responsibility for our behaviour. I tried to be very well behaved as Foreign Minister. I thought it was appropriate for the dignity of that position, so I didn't engage. But in opposition, you certainly are there to take out a minister. I mean, that's one of your KPIs.
Some of this behaviour is being addressed too in other parliaments. For example, the Swedish Parliament and the Swiss Parliament have now got independent bodies within the Parliament to anonymously receive calls from their politicians if they feel they're being harassed or bullied. So they're trying to readdress the way that politicians interact with each other. I think getting more women in Parliament would change the dynamic, particularly if you've got a critical mass. And on that point, I'd like to invite a question from a woman.
I would too. Plenty of questions. We'll come to this woman just here in the front here.
Hello, my name is Kate. And I'm a former scientist. So I actually did my PhD in Australia, but then I didn't see much probably fortune again to get from being a scientist in Australia. So the question is, like, Australia trying to move from being a resource country to innovation country. So I still don't see the shift. So the question is to Julie Bishop. So do you think it will happen soon? And what's the government pathway to achieve this innovation agenda and future in Australia?
I absolutely see the shift. We are diversifying our economy, we're diversifying our trading partners. Of course, we are a resource-rich energy superpower, and we also have a significant agricultural base, so we are blessed with natural resources. But I think our greatest natural resource is, in fact, our people and their innovative and creative abilities and capabilities. And I think Australians are doing extraordinarily well on the world stage. You just have to go to Silicon Valley. I know it's over there, but you just go to Silicon Valley and you see the number of bright young Australians who are doing amazing things and with the very best creative minds in the world and coming back to Australia. I see a lot of energy in our creative, innovative research sectors. In health and medical research, we're attracting back to Australia, or attracting to Australia, some of the best health and medical researchers in the world. And I was at Perth Children's Hospital the other day, a brand new, fantastic hospital, incredible infrastructure. And some of the best paediatric researchers are coming back to Perth, or coming to Perth, because of the opportunities it presents. So it depends very much on the sector, of course. But I think that we're certainly holding our own in that regard.
But is there not suspicion about innovation? I mean, why would the minister have oversight over research and development now and ticking off on development grants? I mean, isn't that an indication that maybe our politics is still suspicious of innovation?
I just think it's ministerial oversight. We all have to be held accountable for the limited resources that we have through the public purse, and the government is quite rightly held to a very high standard of scrutiny, and I think that ministerial oversight's not a bad thing.
Okay, we've got some more questions.
Hi, my name's Kate Clayton. I was just wondering, given your work as Foreign Minister, Ms Bishop, as well as on the 2017 White Paper, what did you make of Daniel Andrews' Belt and Road deal, and what does this mean for Australia's role, if it has any effect of our role in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, as I understand it, a Premier of a state, so in this case Daniel Andrews, Victoria, has entered into some kind of agreement with the central government of China in relation to the One Belt, One Road infrastructure initiative. I'm not aware of the details. I don't know if anybody's aware of them. It's rather unusual for this to occur in this way. given that you would normally expect such a matter to be at least in cooperation or collaboration with the national government if you're dealing with the national government of another country. So I'm not sure what he was seeking to achieve or how it's going to manifest. One Belt, One Road is not as transparent as you would like it to be. I think that China is putting a lot of its infrastructure funding under the umbrella of One Belt, One Road, but whether it actually is a One Belt, One Road initiative is not something that we can actually determine. And the whole idea of One Belt, One Road was to support developing countries. So I'm not sure whether Daniel Andrews is putting Victoria in the position of a developing country. It's a mystery to me. I don't know what he's seeking to achieve, and we haven't seen the details. But Australia is working in partnership with a number of countries around the world to increase the level of infrastructure funding, particularly in the Pacific. There is a massive shortage of global investment in much needed infrastructure. So whether it's China or Japan or the United States or the European Union, we certainly encourage more investment in infrastructure in our part of the world.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that, and then we'll get to you, Judith. With the situation, that lack of faith now in international norms which have underpinned the success of cooperation across the globe for the last 50 years, China has stepped into the breach in a way and is flexing its muscles, its economic might, and having influence not only in the Pacific but in Africa, in all parts of the globe. As countries, democracies retreat from that interdependence, what's the consequence of that?
I think a number of developing countries are currently considering and comparing the democratic model and the economic model that has seen such success, particularly in Southeast Asia, or starting with Japan, Korea, but also that market economy success that we've seen, and the more authoritarian model that China is presenting. And they are making up their minds at present. We've seen some formerly strong democratic nations become more authoritarian. I mean, thinking of Turkey and Poland and Hungary and Thailand and others. And so I think democracies, and I remember giving a speech in Germany to the EU that successful democracies should be promoting the benefits of what they can show for developing countries who are currently juggling whether they should go down the China model or the liberal democratic Western model. And it's a responsibility of us all to spell out the benefits.
I was just going to make the comment that state governments have always tried to attract foreign investment themselves without necessarily having to go through the federal government, but it's complicated in the case of China because the investor is actually the government.
My name is Raghupati Ravi from Indian media. My question to Julia Bishop. Current economic environment, hardworking Australians living every day by hidden cost of living, and every opposition leader, current leader and past prime minister, there is no leadership consistency, and the world is laughing now. Look at in Australia, there is a 4 years in 3 prime ministers, and Turnbull says that stronger economy, but when you say stronger economy, there is no without any proper constructive, collective, collaborative way of with the fellow MPs, what we can achieve and how we can have a strong dollar value. Look at the Singapore, they have a 40-kilometer country, they have a consistency stronger dollar. And look at the Australia, natural resources. But what my observation, last 21 years I live in Australia, there is no politicians, everybody have a personal interest but not national interest. What is your comments? Thank you.
I would be very interested to hear your analysis of the Indian political system and how you think that compares, and the Indian economic growth over years and how it's compared with Australia. I think India is currently growing at about 6 or 7%, which is obviously a significant trajectory of economic growth, but Australia, as a developed mature economy has also been doing extraordinarily well. 27 years, so it's through various iterations of governments. I don't accept that the majority of politicians are in it for themselves. I certainly am not. I believe that most politicians are looking at the national interest. We just have a different view on how we should achieve better outcomes and raise standards of living. But I think that the change in leaders over recent times has been unfortunate, but it hasn't prevented Australia continuing to grow, continuing to provide employment opportunities, continuing to be at the forefront of technological changes, continuing to be a significant voice on the world stage, continuing to advocate for democracy, freedom, choice. And I think that as a nation, we can be very quick to criticise the political class. I've been talking about it tonight. But overall, if you sit back and compare Australia with other democracies around the world, I would suggest that we fare pretty well.
Can I just throw that to the panel? John, do you think that most Australians still believe that their politicians are there fundamentally to do the right thing by the Australian people?
I think that's very hard to know. I think there's two. When Australians, I've observed it, actually meet politicians, they're very respectful. I remember seeing endless people just wanting to be photographed with John Howard. Then there's pub talk, where we all want ways to let off steam and find people to blame, and the public stage for this is politics. So I think there's a lot said in sort of disgruntled evening chit chat, which isn't very, very deeply felt, and that the sort of conservative Australian respect for order and liking things to continue pretty much as they are has a big overlap with what is actually a much more respectful view of politics than comes out in the media and comes out in lots of tossed off comments. So I take it with a grain of salt to some degree. Their politicians are hopeless, they're selfish, and so forth.
I'd just add to that about how hardworking politicians are. Constant engagements, having to keep on top of the news cycle, having the Parliament in Canberra means long treks away from home, especially if you're a minister in WA. That's a long flight, 18 sitting weeks a year, not to mention all the other work that goes, especially if you're foreign minister, of overseas travel. It's a huge impost and tax on a person's personal life and their family life. And I think as a broader public, we don't give enough credit back to that. So I am firmly of the belief that politicians are doing it primarily because they want to make Australia a better place. I have no doubt about that. And I think we often underestimate just how hard they do work and aren't there telling us about that because it's not their style.
We've got maybe time. We might fit two more questions in, then we have to go. So.
Hi, my name is Georgie Blom. Thank you, panellists, for your time this morning. I have a question for Ms. Bishop. I was just wondering, given the current trade war between China and the US, where Australia fits into this, given your foreign minister experience? Thank you.
China is Australia's #1 merchandise trading partner. We're not alone in that. Probably 120, 130 countries around the world would nominate China as their #1 trading partner. The United States is also one of our most significant economic partners, by far the largest source of foreign direct investment, and number 2 or maybe 3 in terms of a trading partner. So they are both exceedingly important economic and trading partners for us. A trade war between the United States and China is in no one's interests. It would lead to, I believe, significant damage to the global economy. So we have been urging both China and the United States to resolve their differences through the WTO. Now, I don't believe that that's going to happen, but I do believe that given what is at stake and given that both countries realise the importance of their bilateral relationship, that they will resolve their differences bilaterally. They will avoid the WTO. The WTO is somewhat encumbered at present because it hasn't got an appeal process. The US haven't agreed to any renewal of the appellate members, and so it can't actually hear appeals from disputes, and so neither the US nor China would subject themselves to a WTO hearing at first instance. I expect that it will be resolved bilaterally. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a free trade agreement between the United States and China.
Final question for the evening, up the back.
Thank you very much, speakers. As an ageing engineer, I have the pleasure of not having to worry about social media. The laws of physics and mathematics support engineers greatly. How are we going to overcome social media to allow nuclear power to be introduced into Australia? The technology is terrific these days, but social media keeps knocking out the thought of nuclear power. So congratulations on mentioning it, but how do we get it past social media?
Well, when I was Science Minister in 2006-2007, I looked at the issue of nuclear power and in fact commissioned Ziggy Swetowski, who is a nuclear physicist, to look at the economic case for nuclear power. And as I recollect, his report was that it wasn't yet economically viable without government intervention and of course, or government support or subsidy, and that wasn't the answer I was looking for. But what I would call for is just a bipartisan discussion about it. It's always rejected from any discussion we have about potential energy sources. I mean, even before we have the discussion, we have to rule out nuclear power because of the scare campaigns that are able to be built up around it. I just want to have a debate about it. I want to have a discussion about it. I want to see the facts on the table. I want to see the examples from other countries, you know, what the true position in Japan is, what's actually happening in Germany, what's going on in France in terms of nuclear power, in China, in the United States, Taiwan. But in this country, there seems to be such a paranoia about even a discussion on nuclear power that you just can't get off first base. And probably the truth is only a Labor government could ever introduce a discussion about nuclear, because if we ever raise it, the debate reduces to the level of, you know, Julie Bishop, will you rule out putting a nuclear power station on Cottesloe Beach? I mean, that's how puerile the discussion becomes very quickly.
Okay, can you please thank our panellists, Julie Bishop, Judith Brett, Andrea Carson, John Carroll, and for your questions, and I would like to invite the Chancellor back to the stage.
Well, thanks very much, Francis. I'd like to thank you for your expert chairing of the panel. I thought the three panellists, I'll come to Ms Bishop in a moment, were terrific for the clarity of your expositions. I haven't heard a panel that has got messages across quite as clearly as the three of you have. It's a wonderful discussion. And Julie, your opening keynote and your response to questions showed absolute command of the situation, both the political situation and some of the domestic issues we're facing. We're very fortunate to have you in Parliament. I'm delighted you've decided, despite the shenanigans that have gone on recently, to continue in Parliament. We certainly need more people like you representing us in Parliament. So thank you to everyone who's been speaking, and I'm going to thank some other people as well. We've had a fantastic series this year, both in the bold thinking and bold thinking series and the Ideas and Society series. They're all available on podcast if you've missed them, and you can find those through the website. I'd like to thank Chris Mackey, who's been the organiser of the series, and also the events team at La Trobe, Sally Carmen, Keely Murray and Christina Liu, for putting tonight together and putting the other events in the series together. And I'd thank Tony Walker, Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at La Trobe, who's been doing quite a lot of work behind the scene. And Ms Bishop did confide in me that it's Tony's persuasiveness that got her here today. So thank you, Tony, as well. Before I invite you to join us for drinks and canopies in the foyer, I also wanted to mention La Trobe University Press. It's now a joint imprint with Black Ink, and La Trobe University has now produced a number of books by leading scholars and experts, and readings will be selling books in the foyer. Included in that will be the enigmatic Mr. Deacon, which already has been suggested to me as something that my children, who are always looking for something to give me for Christmas, since I have everything, are going to give me one. I'll buy one tonight to give to one of the children to give to me for Christmas. Thank you also in the audience. I think we've had an incredibly informed audience asking really sensible questions, and it's given the panel a chance to expand on the comments that were made in the opening dialogue. So thank you all, and please enjoy the canopies and drinks with us. Thank you.